So,
I didn't see her.
hi. Hi.
Wait,
Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
Should sit in front of the computer.
Oh, then I can't hear.
Yeah. Okay, only we can see
like,
Got it.
21. Miss Fortune? Miss Fortune?
This is for June. You need to connect the audio.
Fortune?
See if I can find Miss Fortune.
Fortune?
This is for June.
I'm pretty sure she'll figure it out. Adam,
Where's Miss Fortune?
look at my shirt.
Where is Miss Fortune? I'm with
You just go do your thing. I'll
Wait.
You're not muted, Tammy. You're not muted.
Axel,
Yes?
look at my shirt.
It's unspeakable.
Yes.
Unspeakable merch. Wait, Zoe.
Nigelson.
Joey,
Nigelson.
unspeakable merch. Unspeakable merch, Joey.
Yes.
Whoa.
What happened to Mrs. Fortune?
I don't know.
Joey.
Muted. Miss Fortune, you're muted.
She's muted and she has turned audio into video. I'm almost they can hear you.
She's muted.
Hello, Sasha's back.
Joey.
Hey, Joey.
Miss Fortune, subscribe to you. There you are, Miss
I
Fortune.
subscribe
to you.
You are?
You did. I did.
Hey, Joey. You're the 19th one, aren't you?
Mm-hmm. I am sure
Hey.
I am.
I'm wondering how I got one more.
No, I was your 18th. I subscribed to your 5th.
What's your fifth subscriber? Axel, you're still asking me where is your channel? So you
No, I found it 2 months ago. I found it.
No, what are you doing?
Yeah, I found it.
doing?
I have my own YouTube channel.
Mama, what are you doing?
Yeah. Good job.
I think 11 subscribers.
What are you doing? Oh, this new stuff. Great. Stop it. The last. How can I close the beginning? You can do
No.
Joey.
What?
This year was 7 on the floor. Have you heard of that app Unspeakable made? The Chasecraft?
Yes, I play that.
What?
Hi guys, can you all hear me? Great. Okay. Looks like we're just about all here. There we go. I've got you all muted. I'm going to keep checking for people to show up in the waiting room, but we are ready to get started. Now, I am trying to keep the chat set so that you can type a message to me, but you should not be able to type messages privately to other people in the group. So I'm gonna try to keep it that way. I don't need updates. If you notice that that's not set the correct way, I don't need your updates throughout the read aloud. But just so you know, that's my plan, because the point of this gathering is for you to be listening to the story, right guys? Okay, It's good to see you all. I've already seen most of you today already. It's almost like a normal school day where I've given a few lessons today. Isn't that nice? Okay, well, I'm going to dive right in to chapter 5. So let's see where we left off. Oh, yes. Harold the dog and Chester the cat were looking at a book about vampires. And as they were looking at the book about vampires, they realized that the bunny, Bunnicula, had gotten loose again. And when they went to investigate, do you remember what they found by the refrigerator? Who remembers? Alina, what did they find?
They found a white zucchini.
A white zucchini, which is a type of squash, that green squash. Okay, so that's where we left off with a big surprise. Chapter 5, Chester goes into his act. The next morning, I was awakened by a scream. Robert, Robert, come here right away. There's something wrong in the kitchen. For a moment, panic seized me. I thought she had run out of dog food. But then I remembered the events of the previous evening. Mr. Monroe came bounding down the stairs. Chester, Chester, I cried. Did you see Mr. Monroe? His face has turned white. It's Bunnicula, isn't it? No, he said calmly. It's shaving cream. By now, the excitement in the kitchen was at full throttle. The table was covered with Bunnicula's handiwork. There were white beans and white peas and white squash and white tomatoes and white lettuce and white zucchini. What can it mean, Robert? Mrs. Monroe was saying. I'm getting worried. One tomato is a curiosity, but this is unheard of. There must be something wrong with our refrigerator. That's it. It's turning all the vegetables white. But look, she said, I left these tomatoes on the windowsill, and they're white too. And this squash I left in the bowl on the table. At that moment, Pete and Toby came into the kitchen. Holy cow, what's going on? Hey, maybe it's a vegetable blight, Mom. Could that be, Robert? Did you ever hear of anything like that? I should explain what a blight is. Does anybody know? You ever heard of a blight? So a blight is, oh, Andres knows.
A blight is kind of like a sickness that causes things to die.
You're exactly right. That's a great definition, Andres. Very good. Yeah, so you might have a famous one is when you think about in Ireland. If you've ever heard of the Irish potato famine, which happened, I don't know, 100 years ago or so, where they had a diet and an economy that really depended on potatoes, and then all the potatoes died, and they couldn't grow their potatoes, and people really suffered. Huge numbers of people suffered. So that's a blight. Sam, what did you want to say about blights?
Nothing actually.
Oh,
You asked who knew about the Irish potato famine, and I was like, yes, I do. But you
oh, great.
didn't.
Okay, so you had heard of the Irish potato famine. Okay, great.
I have a book.
For those that just joined us from the waiting room, the family is discovering the white vegetables in the kitchen. And Pete and Toby are wondering if it's a vegetable blight. Could that be, Robert? Did you ever hear of anything like that? Well, no, actually. That is, I've heard of blight, but nothing like this. Chester leaned my way. This will take forever if we leave it up to them. Sometimes human beings can be so slow. There's Annie. Hi. I started to answer him, but he was heading for the table. What about that friend of yours in the agriculture department? Oh, Tom Cragen? Could we call him and ask him if we're doing something wrong? It's DDT, Mom, Peter interjected. I know about this stuff. It's because you buy vegetables that aren't organic. All vegetables are organic, Peter, Mrs. Monroe replied. That's not what my teacher says. See, Toby, I told you this would happen. They're using chemicals on our food, and if you're not careful, you'll turn white too. Like Dad? Robert, couldn't you take that shaving cream off your face? Oh, yes, of course. Where's my towel? I know I brought it down with me. For that matter, where was Chester? I had seen him going toward the table, but I had lost track of him listening to all that talk about DDT. I just hoped they didn't use any of that stuff where they grew the chocolate cupcakes. Pete, did you take my towel? Why would I take your towel, Dad? I don't shave. Just then, the door swung open. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was Chester, with Mr. Monroe's towel draped across his back and tied under his neck like a cape. That was strange enough, but on his face was an expression that sent chills down my spine. His eyes were wide and staring. The corners of his mouth were pulled back in an evil grimace. His teeth were bared and gleaming in the morning light. He cackled menacingly and threw back his head as if he were laughing at all of us. I thought he'd completely lost his mind. There's my towel. What's the matter with you, Chester? Were you cold? Mr. Monroe bent down to take the towel from Chester. Before he could lay his hands on it, Chester flipped over onto his back, closed his eyes, and folded his paws over his chest. It was a hideous sight. He opened his eyes wide. With paws outstretched, he slowly lifted his head. His eyes glazed and vacant. Soon the upper half of his body followed, all in one smooth flow until he was in a sitting position. Hey, Dad, did you leave your brandy glass out last night? Chester's acting a little weird. Well, son, cats are funny creatures. I glanced at Chester. He wasn't laughing. Psst, Chester, what are you up to? I'm a vampire, you dolt. Can't you tell? I'm trying to warn them. Well, it's not working. You'd better think of something else. Chester frowned, apparently deep in thought. So you see, Toby, Mr. Monroe was explaining, all cats are as individual as people. Maybe he just wants to get our attention. Isn't that right, kitty cat? Ordinarily, Chester would have left the room upon being called kitty cat, but he was lost in thought. Come on, Chester, give me back my towel. Mr. Monroe moved toward Chester. Chester's eyes lit up. He looked at me and smiled. I sensed I was not going to like what he had in mind. I was toying with the notion of slinking under the table when Chester fixed me with his eyes. How deep they were, like black pools. I felt myself floating, lost in them, my will no longer my own. I felt an inexplicable urge to murmur, "Yes, master," when he walked slowly, steadily toward me. As he grew nearer, I found myself unable to move. He stopped before me, never taking his gaze from me, and lunged. Yow! Mom, Chester bit Harold on the neck. Aw, that wasn't a real bite, was it, Chester? My foot, that hurt. Chester, what's the matter with you? I sputtered, do I look like a tomato? Oh, it doesn't matter anyway, Harold. They don't understand. How can human beings read all the same books that I do and still be so thick? Our conversation was interrupted. Mrs. Monroe picked Chester up and cuddled him. I was praying she would not add insult to injury by kissing his nose, which he hates more than anything. Give me 1 second. Poor Chester, do you need a little love? Do you know what I'm going to do, you big ball of fuzz, you? Uh-oh, I could tell what was coming. I'm going to kiss you on your little nose. Yep, I could tell that was coming all right. Chester knew better than to resist. He went limp in Mrs. Monroe's arms. Mr. Monroe took his towel off Chester. I still don't know why he's wearing my towel, he said. I think he must be cold, dear. Here's your towel. Why don't you go get his kitty sweater? Chester looks like he might be getting ill. And he could wear that sweater all day. As Chester was being buttoned into his bright yellow sweater with little purple mice in cowboy hats all over it, Mr. Monroe said, Now what about those vegetables? Shall I speak to Tom Cragen? Yes, dear, Mrs. Monroe said. Why don't you? I'm sure there's some explanation. In the meantime, I'll change markets. To tell you the truth, I'm really much more worried about Chester. We'd better keep our eye on him. Chester and I did not speak until late afternoon. I was busy nursing my neck, and Chester was busy hiding under the sofa, too embarrassed to be seen. When we did speak at last, it was a brief exchange. Hey, Chester, I called when he finally crawled out from under. We don't have to worry about any vampire bunnies anymore. All you have to do is stand outside his cage in that sweater, and he'll laugh himself to death. Chester was not amused. That's right, make fun, all of you. No one understands. I tried to warn them, and they wouldn't heed. Now I'm going to take matters into my own hands. Whereupon Chester and his 16 purple mice went into the kitchen for dinner. Chapter 6. Harold Helps Out. That night I had an uneasy sleep. Strange noises emanated from downstairs. It sounded like toenails clicking back and forth on the floor. It must be Bunnicula making his midnight run, I thought, although I'd never known him to make a sound. And I smelled the funniest odor in the air, something familiar, though I couldn't place it. As the night progressed, it grew stronger and stronger until finally it tickled my nose, and I sneezed myself awake. I jumped off Toby's bed, still sniffling, and headed down the stairs for the living room to find Chester to see if he could smell it too. The odor grew even stronger as I approached the living room. Standing in the doorway was Chester, a strange pendant hanging from his neck. Phew, Chester, I said, what are you wearing that awful thing for? It smells. Of course it smells, he replied. Here, I made one for you too. Put it on. Are you kidding? That thing smells like garlic. It is garlic, Chester stated matter-of-factly. Why are you wearing garlic? I asked, thinking that by this time, Chester was capable of anything. As we walked into the living room, I tripped on another piece of garlic lying in the doorway. Careful, said Chester, watch your step. I surveyed the room and saw that it was strewn with garlic. On the doorways, over the windows, and around Bunnicula's cage. The poor little fellow had buried his nose as far as possible under his blanket. I was about to follow his example and return to Toby's bed to bury my nose under the blankets, when Chester grabbed my tail with his teeth. You're not leaving this room until you put this on, he grumbled at me. I think that's what he said. I wasn't sure because he had my tail in his mouth. It's not polite to talk with your mouth full, Chester. Drop that tail. Meanwhile, my eyes were beginning to water. Listen, Chester snapped at me, fortunately letting go of my tail first. The book said to use garlic. What book? I asked. The Joy of Cooking? Chester continued. The mark of the vampire says that garlic renders vampires immobile. What does that mean? It means they can't go anywhere if there's garlic around. Well, I've got news for you, Chester. I can't go anywhere either. The smell is killing me. But you've got to put it on. It says so in the book. If you don't put it on, I'll put it on for you. Oh, Chester, I said as my nose suddenly and involuntarily closed. I'll be leaving this room right now. And I did. I was so sick to my stomach from the aroma that I decided to spend the early morning hours outdoors. As dawn approached, it seemed that it would be a peaceful day. The sky was clear, the birds were singing, and I felt contented after my difficult night just to be lying in the grass, feeling the ladybugs crawl up my ears. Suddenly, the calm was broken. Strange, piercing screams came from the area of the kitchen. Not again, I thought. What's turned white now? As it happened, it was Chester. There in the sink, lathered with soap, was the feline detective, yelling his head off. Mrs. Monroe was scrubbing him vigorously and, from the sound of her voice, was in the middle of a long lecture. I don't know what has gotten into you, Chester. You've never played with garlic before. I thought you hated the smell of it, and here you've gotten it all over yourself. Stop wriggling. You'll get soap in your eyes. If you want to chew on something, I'll get you some catnip. But stay out of my herbs. Then she rinsed him off, rubbed him with a towel, and plunked him down in front of the stove to finish drying. Shut the door, he hissed at me. I'm freezing. That silly woman, doesn't she know cats don't get baths? What do you mean? I get baths all the time, I said, closing the door with my back foot. That's because you're too dumb to bathe yourself. Cats always bathe themselves. It's a rule. Everyone knows that. Well, at least it smells nice in here again, I sniffed as I settled down next to Chester by the stove. And it's all toasty warm here in the kitchen. Sure, it smells nice again, he said, but now the house isn't safe anymore. What do you mean? I asked, getting closer. I mean, it worked last night. The garlic worked. No more vegetables turned white, did they? No, but that means Bunnicula didn't get out of his cage last night. Maybe he was just tired, I said. Or maybe he was full. Don't be ridiculous, he replied. It was the garlic. He couldn't leave his cage. But tonight he'll be free to roam again, and I've got to find a way to stop him that isn't smelly. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were hurrying in and out of the room, stepping over us, late for work. Mrs. Monroe yelled up to Toby, "Don't forget to take the steak out of the freezer when you get home today, Toby, and leave it on the table to defrost. And this time, please remember to put a plate under it." Chester's ears perked up. "Of course," he said, "that's what I'll do." And he strolled past me with a knowing smile. Mrs. Monroe turned off the stove and left the room. It was too much for me to figure out, so I went to sleep on the nice warm kitchen floor. I was awakened by a bite on the ear. Chester was sitting by me, looking very impatient. "Boy, nothing wakes you up," he said. "I've been yelling and poking at you for 10 minutes. "I was dreaming," I answered defensively, "about a place where there weren't any cats around to bother nice dogs and wake them up when they needed their rest." "You can finish sleeping later," he said crisply. "Right now, you have to help me." "Do what?" I asked. "Get Bunnicula out of the cage." I sprang back. "Get him out of the cage? I thought that was what you didn't want. I thought you said he was dangerous. What if he attacks me?" "Aren't you ashamed?" Chester replied. "Afraid of a harmless little bunny." "Harmless? I thought you said he was a threat to this house and everyone in it. Isn't that what you said? Isn't that what we have been talking about all this time?" "He is a threat, but only at night. During the day, he's just a very sleepy rabbit, and that's why we have to do it now, while the sun is still up. Follow me," he said. "There isn't much time. Toby stayed down here forever, and the others will be home soon. Boy, you must have been tired, Harold. You slept right through lunch." I followed Chester into the living room. My heart was pounding as he unlocked the cage door with his paw. It looked as if he'd had years of experience opening locks. The door swung open. Bunnicula was sleeping peacefully. He did, however, look like a little green around the gills, probably from the garlic. I was just wondering how a rabbit could have gills when Chester said, "Okay, Harold, do your stuff and get what I need while I get what I need from the kitchen." "What do you want me to do? I can't exactly read your mind." "Get him out of the cage and onto the floor, and I'll be right back," Chester said. "What? What? What? I verbalized. How am I supposed to do that? Use your head, he answered. And then he was gone. Okay, you can shut the door if you want. Looking at the cage, I realized that was precisely what I would have to do. Until this moment, I had never had to face the possibility of actual physical contact with a real live rabbit. I looked upon my chore reluctantly. I seemed to recall my grandfather telling me that one picked up a rabbit by its neck with one's teeth. This I attempted, though the very idea set my stomach churning. I squeezed my head through the tiny door and gently placed my teeth around the skin of the bunny's neck. To avoid any suggestion of violence, I've never been one for the sport of hunting. I preferred to think of myself as the creature's mother, carrying it off to safety. Unfortunately, I couldn't carry it anywhere, for once my head was in the cage, it wouldn't come out again. I could go neither forward nor backward. At that moment, Chester appeared at the door, carrying in his mouth what looked every bit like a nice, big, juicy, raw steak. My eyes popped. My teeth dropped Bunnicula. My mouth opened and I began to drool. After all, I had missed lunch. Chester, what are you doing with that steak? Haven't you gotten him out of there yet? I can't get either of us out of here. My head's stuck. Oh, Harold, sometimes I despair of you. Here, I'll get you both out. I should have done everything myself. He came over, dropped the steak just a few feet away from me, and climbed up on my shoulders. You pull your head out while I push against the cage. Who gets the steak? I asked. Don't worry about the steak, Harold. Just pull. I would have more motivation if I knew who is to get the steak. Chester ignored me. I pulled. He pushed. I felt something go pop. We all fell in a jumble. Chester, the cage, Bunnicula, and me. When I looked around, Bunnicula was lying next to me, still sound asleep. There you are, I said. We got him out. Now let's eat. No dice, Chester said. Just read this to me so I'll be sure I'm doing it right. And he handed me a book. That book again. Start at the top of the page, Chester said as he picked up the steak. Why don't you read and I'll hold the steak? Uh-huh, Chester replied. I took it to mean that I was to start reading. To destroy the vampire and end his reign of terror, it is necessary to pound a sharp steak. Chester interrupted. A sharp steak, he asked. What does that mean? I'll taste it for you and tell you if it's sharp, I offered. Oh, never mind. This will have to do. It's sirloin. Keep reading. Do you guys get the problem here? Who can see what the problem is? Miles?
Like a steak is something that they usually use like in stories. It's not quite like a regular steak. It's like a pointy steak, like a giant fork.
Yes. So steak, spelled S-T-A-K-E, means a sharp stick that is used to, usually like the stakes you probably have used are the ones that you use to hold up a tent. They're the pointy parts that go into the ground to hold the strings of your tent down to the ground. The steak that Chester has retrieved from the kitchen is spelled S-T-E-A-K. So there's been some confusion. Chester has made a mistake. He made a mistake and he got the wrong steak. Okay. Keep reading. To pound a sharp stake into the vampire's heart. This must be done during the daylight hours when the vampire has no powers. Okay, he said, this is it. I'm sorry I had to go this far, but if they had just listened, this wouldn't have been necessary. He dragged the steak across the floor and laid it across the inert bunny. Then with his paws, he began to hit the steak. Chester, are you sure this is what they mean? Am I anywhere near his heart? He asked. It's hard to tell, I said. All I can really see are his nose and his ears. You know, he's really sort of cute. Chester was getting that glint in his eyes again. He was pounding away at the steak, harder and harder. Be careful, I cried. You'll hurt him. Chester increased his attack. I was really getting worried when the door opened and Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were suddenly with us in the room. Chester, Mrs. Monroe screamed. What are you doing with our dinner? Robert, get that steak away from Chester. And what's the matter with Benicula? Why is he on the floor? Mr. Monroe took that beautiful steak away. I wished it a fond farewell with tears in my eyes. As the kitchen door swung open, Chester whispered with cold determination, All right, the last resort, and dashed into the kitchen. Seconds later, he was back, carrying his water dish between his teeth. He ran toward Benicula and with a mad yowl threw the dish of water at the rabbit. Unfortunately, he was so hysterical that his aim was not the best. With water dripping from my ears, I watched Mrs. Monroe pick Chester up by the scruff of his neck and toss him unceremoniously out the front door. Robert, we are going to have to do something about that cat. Look at this mess. Dinner is ruined, and the poor bunny is out of his cage, and Harold is sopping wet. I tried to look as pathetic as I knew how. Aw, poor Harold, Mrs. Monroe cooed as she dried me off. You've had a rough day, you and Benicula. I don't know what's the matter with your friend, but unless he learns how to behave, he'll just have to spend the night outside. Mr. Monroe, meanwhile, had restored Benicula to his cage and the cage to the windowsill. I couldn't believe it when I saw that Benicula was still asleep. Anne, Mr. Monroe said, the steak is ruined. Why don't we let Harold have it? He deserves a treat anyway, don't you, old boy? I panted appropriately. After my delicious dinner, I turned my attention to the book still lying open on the floor. Another method of destroying the vampire is to immerse the body in water. The body will then shrivel and disappear as the vampire emits one last scream of terror. Phew, I thought. So that's what he was trying to do. Thank goodness he missed. I had no regrets about missing a scene like that. Poor Benicula. I looked over toward the cage, and there on the other side of the window was a pathetic tabby face looking in. His little nose was pressed against the window. I couldn't hear him, but from the movement of his lips, I could see that he was very unhappy. Poor Chester. As for me, Mrs. Monroe spent the evening petting me, and the family chatted with me all night long. And of course, I'd had my yummy steak dinner, so it wasn't such a bad day after all. Except that now my steak was all gone. Poor Harold. Okay, I will stop there. I'm feeling kind of bad for poor Chester. He seems to really want to protect this family, and nobody will listen to him. Alina.
So your voice, it's not like, so when you say something, you say something, and then so you say something, and then your mouth moves after it, and it's not like.
Oh, there's a delay. So
Yeah.
the sound is traveling at a different rate than the picture, huh?
Yeah.
That can be frustrating.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that, but you're able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just that, yeah.
Yeah, that can be really frustrating. I'm sorry. I always hate that if I'm watching Netflix and that happens, I get frustrated. Yes, Joey.
Did Ava and Eleanor do it to everyone in the chat?
I wonder how that's possible. Okay, so I'm gonna have to investigate that because I have it set that the only person they can chat with is me. And that's supposed to go for everybody. So I'm not sure what's happening, but I will ask that you stop. If you are able to type messages to the other kids, I would like you to stop, please. I can also just turn it off, but I don't know. Maybe I will look into that and see if I can figure out why that is. But guys, if you're typing messages to the other kids while I'm reading, that's distracting them from the story.
And Miss Fortune?
Yes.
Also, Miles's name is FBI.
Yeah, that part is okay. I don't mind that part so much. Okay, any other questions before we head out? Ada.
That's so like you on my end, you've disabled like the chat to everyone. Now it only wait, hold on one second. Oh yeah. You've done host disabled attendee chat.
Great.
Okay, good.
That's what I assume. So
Yes.
when I had it before, let me change it. Okay, now can you look and tell me what it says?
To Tracy Fortune privately.
Great.
And then
Okay.
if I tap it, it won't have a list of people. It'll only just stay like that.
Right, and that's how I would like to be able to leave it, because that way, if you do have a question, you can tell me in the chat without disrupting the reading for everyone. So
Okay.
for me, it would be ideal to leave that open so that you can type messages to me. But
There's a new thing
unfortunately,
called invite.
yeah, somehow there's a, what do you think it is, Joey?
It's next to the mute me in the lower hand.
Uh-huh.
It's called invite.
Huh. Invite. Oh, so that they're using.
Oh yeah.
That's different. Okay. But, huh. What comes up if you click invite, Joey?
It comes up, choose your email service to send
I see.
invitation.
But that shouldn't show up for everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, if you
It
type an
says
email
default
there.
email, Gmail, or Yahoo Mail.
Right. Yeah. Don't click on that. Okay. I think I'll work on that. I'll do some investigating, see what I can find out. Okay. Hey guys, it was good to see you. I've had a good day because I've seen a lot of you today, and I love it. So, Gavin, do you have what is that, a tortilla? I thought it was a big cookie for a second. Are you having a
Toast.
toast? Okay. All right. Hey guys, have a great afternoon. The snow is almost completely melted, so you could actually play outside on the grass and throw a snowball at the same time. So I will see you tomorrow. Okay. Miles, did you have a question?
No, I was just waving.
Just waving. Okay, I'm gonna unmute you so you can wave away.
No.
Bye, guys.
I'll see you at 5 or 4. Bye.
Who's playing the piano? My brother. Who's playing the piano?
My
Sam, is
brother
that Ben?
is playing again.
This is for two.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, Leo.
Did you start the phone without me?
Leo, you joined a little bit late, honey. I'm sorry. But I will post it so you can watch it, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome, kiddo. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. See you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.